In the last episode, we toured Dr. Jeff Block's tropical backyard oasis. So in this episode, we'll carry on the tour through his conservatory and greenhouse. All right, Jeff, so we're in a different part of your place. This is more kind of like indoor-outdoor. Tell us where we are.
We're in a portion of the home that from inside glass walls look out upon. And it gets southern exposure, which at our latitude here means it gets some of the best light all year round. Right now we're kind of early morning, but throughout the year this is the staging place where we'll put things from the greenhouse setting, which is the most controlled, to here, which may look open and outdoors, but it's actually screened in. Pool screening, patio type screens that are popular in South Florida are used here. So it has some protection from the rare hailstorm or things like that, as well as from direct sun. So between that, the amended soils here that are not necessarily as alkaline as most of Florida's soils are, plus the quality of the water being rainwater quality through the non-rainy season, makes this area something that looks the way it does because it's constrained, contrived, and yet probably more consistent with what you'd find in the South Pacific than in the Southeast US.
And then you have one of these incredible palms here, right? You have a ton of these on your property.
I don't know about a ton, but there's 3 or 4 that are of good size planted out. It's called Certostachys renda, and most notably given a colloquial name of the lipstick palm for the red there, or even sealing wax palm. I find it's one of the most ornate palms because of how that red color just pops, and red catches my eyes, especially in the winter. So this palm here is one of a challenge. There's one straight through here, Johannes Tasmanii magnifica known because the bottom of the leaf actually is silver frosted, but those big paddles, and that's about a 20-year-old palm right there, so very slow growing.
I love the leaf shape of that.
And then, of course, perhaps the most notable backdrop is the backdrop. That is a living wall, and you'll see them in other places a little more contrived, but this is actually the plant matter that's growing directly on our native coral rock from underneath. And that coral rock, if it's not let to dry out, is a great substrate to support lots of plants.
It almost seems like a tufa stone, you know? I don't know if you know tufa, but that's
I don't.
Yeah, it's like a common porous style stone that had often been used. It's been over harvested, unfortunately. But you obviously have the natural holes and porosity within your natural coral stone.
We do, but there's an old recipe that's written in South Florida folklore from Fairchild Garden where the rock initially is actually not that easy to germinate things on because it is pure limestone, very alkaline. However, if you coat it with something that promotes a layer of moss, then the moss is the real secret for it. It retains the moisture, the pH gets to be different as far as acidity, so that's where spores of ferns in particular will find it very easy to germinate on.
So what's the secret sauce?
The secret sauce. Well, the secret sauce is a mixture slurry of cow manure mixed with buttermilk. If you let buttermilk get somewhat rancid, and you don't invite people over for a while with that mixture, but if you paint it literally on the rock, keep it moist, then after a matter of just a few weeks, you'll start to see the moss grow. And so in fact, even though throughout this full 8-foot high by 80-foot long wet wall, we call it, you see lots of, say, maidenhair ferns or other things, it started with only a few little spores in one place, and then just by itself regenerates in that environment. It's that favorable. So the secret recipe then is mixing a slurry, painting it on. Don't invite anybody over for a few weeks till it cures. But after that, this is what you can look forward to, a great substrate for supporting things on what South Florida doesn't otherwise offer, which is a vertical face. We're very flat here. So in fact, that for a backdrop is why we constructed this many years ago with that recipe.
It reminds me of like making sauerkraut. Like you don't invite anyone over, it stinks.
Exactly. but the final product's delicious.
Absolutely.
At least for the eyes.
Absolutely. Should we go back and see a little more of it? You have some beautiful anthuriums here. I know that you have taken a fondness into hybridizing your own plants and whatnot. Are any of these ones that you had hybridized or ones that you just kind of collected along the way?
Yes, both. The fact is that some of these I've had for close to 40 years. So even though they may not be direct crosses with other things to make a genuine hybrid, what they are is they're selections from an original type that are picked out either for color, cold tolerance, which happens sometimes here in Florida, challenges with cold, maybe color forms, vein patterns. So those things tend to persist. Maybe a better example even than those would be right over here, which is meant to be notably darker and has been around in South Florida for a while. But this is Anthurium that now we call Anthurium Michelle. And so the patterning in it, it's wet now, so it has a little glistening. But these are all things that seem to thrive in this environment. And so with as many flower spikes as you see there, and you can see even some white tags, these are from Anthurium flowers that I've pollinated in order to make new hybrids.
And this is notably your wife's name, isn't it?
It sure is. Shall we walk back here?
Yeah, and why don't you show us a couple of these ones here up above in the canopy?
Oh, okay. Well, that's actually a very interesting plant. If you look at the underside of the leaf, it's
I love the ribbon.
discolored. It's red underneath. And this is actually a good testament for the conditions here mimicking South Pacific. This is Miconia. And Miconia, where it normally comes from in that part of the world, actually is invasive because it grows so fast and is so large that this plant would be illegal in Hawaii. Not enough people necessarily grow it here in the United States to where it becomes a pest problem because our climate is notably different. But in here, I can not only have it, but it's just finished flowering, and then in a matter of a few months, I'll start to see some little seedlings come up. The seeds are tiny, but when they find the right niche, like even in that wall there, they'll start to appear in places that I didn't put it.
And now, would this be considered invasive in Florida, and is that why you're growing it in the interior?
It's never been known to be invasive here because unlike the South Pacific, we lose that water for 7 out of our 12 months. So people don't sustain this through the full year, and it never became a invasive weed in that sense. We have invasive problems here. We're situated in an Everglades ecosystem. I don't know if you've seen how healthy our pythons are lately, but there are certain transplants that certainly find Florida a nice home.
I have not met any pythons, luckily, on this trip, but there's still some days to be had. And now we're getting a nice close-up of your wall with all that good buttermilk and cow manure back there.
And it supports a lot of different plant families. There's even medinilla that are popping out of there from seeds that I never put there. Obviously, Anthuriums, Begonias, there's ferns all throughout. And so,
and you
again,
have a Selaginella carpet.
Well, we do. It doesn't look quite the color that it did a week or so ago. We had a major cold blast come through here just last week. So there are things that are looking a little more off color now, and it's not a humor thing, it's a matter of the actual color. Mm-hmm. This will be almost an iridescent blue color at different times of the year. Now it's looking a little more brownish and yellow, but it'll recover from it. That's a normal seasonal change here. And so we learn to expect it and sort of embrace those changes. I believe I've seen other interest that you had in maidenhair ferns.
Yeah, I love the maidenhair ferns.
Whether small and dainty like that, where you can see all that little detail, or even larger forms, the wall here is a great place to feature those.
It feels so tropical back here, like just the moistness in the air. Do you actually have to fertilize your wall at all? And if so, how do you do it?
You know, I don't fertilize at this point, hardly at all. And it's for good reason. Number one, fertilizing when something's in a pot and small makes a lot of sense, you know, push the root growth and whatever. But here, things really rely more on where plants normally get their nutrients and that's from sunlight. That's what photosynthesis is all about. So these plants, of course, in the wild, where they normally come from, their ecosystem never would have supplied a drop of Peter's solution or other types of fertilizers, granular or liquid. But it's the sun that does something really cool. It takes the sunlight and lets the plant convert it to make its own food. And so more important than extra food from the side is exposure to light that is compatible with what the plant's needs are.
Well, I would also imagine you are creating clearly a habitat back here. It's not just plants in pots. You have it in a somewhat natural habitat, even though it is somewhat contrived. I'd imagine other things are moving in just like you had seedlings. I bet you have different types of bacteria and fungi in here and all sorts of organisms that you could have only ever dreamed of.
Absolutely, and they live in a balance. So trying to find where balances in nature are is part of the trick. Treating with an insecticide, a fungicide, other types of things meant to kill off pathogens. Sometimes, unless those pathogens are falling out of balance with the plant actually surviving, I try not to use things because it upsets that natural balance. Seeing and working within the balances of nature is not only something for plant life, but all animal life requires a balance of mitigating what nature throws our ways. And so that's survival. And when a plant can no longer compensate and becomes out of balance with nature, you know what happens? It becomes extinct.
I love the petioles. I don't know, are these considered petioles on a palm?
Yes,
yeah.
they are.
Ooh.
Yeah, these are black. White elephant is sometimes the name for this. This is Caryodoxa elegans, just pushing out a new flower. This particular palm is dioecious, so there's a female versus a male. This is the male, and I've taken this pollen before to make seeds on this palm and distribute it through our palm society here in South Florida. You know, we're very lucky here. South Florida has a plant community that is family specific. So there's a palm society, there's ferns, bromeliads, orchids, obviously aroids, and all of these groups are great places to learn about not only where these come from and accessing them, but how to grow them better. So plant gardens and gardens in communities throughout the country are great resources. They also have shows where people can bring in and show what they've done with successes or failures. And in particular, judged shows are a great way to learn how to do it better by accredited judges in many plant families.
This one is so striking because the way the light is shining on it and the contrast between the petiole and the underside of the leaf.
That's right.
Exquisite.
And so the fact is, the leaf itself on the other side is in fact very much green.
Yeah.
So the contrast, whether, like we said before with the Miconia, a discolored leaf that maybe is red on the underside versus frosted like this, it gives a different dimension to it. This is a hybrid done by Peter Bach out of Europe, and this one tends to produce flowers that are much longer.
It reminds me of the drapiness of a heliconia.
In a sense. This one tends to be much longer than most, but this one here is a very free flowering form. And so here's some more flowers growing from this angle here. You can capture them. Obviously, the red, like so many other plants, captures the imagination. This is Osa pulcha, which in Costa Rica is where it comes from. Monotypic genus, flowers look a lot like angel's trumpets hanging upside down, smell at night, not at all related, but pound for pound, the rarest plant that's in the garden.
And we had a really bitter cold front that came through that really across the nation, and Florida was not immune to it. So
no, even Southeast Florida had very cool nights where it didn't warm up the next day as it normally happens when our sun comes up. By 9 a.m. after a very cold night, we're already out of the real bad cold.
Right. Look at all the tillandsias around here. Yeah,
this area sort of typifies how epiphytes grow. If you look up here, there's absolutely no soil. Whether orchids, bromeliads, remember, these are things that have been evolving to grow up in tree canopies. And so as far as samples of it, whether hanging from the place we just came out of or outside here in full sun. They never get anything all year round. The more silvery those are, that silver color comes from something called trichomes, which are tiny little hairs that actually allow the plant to absorb humidity. And this one's obviously covered with them.
And also probably to protect from the harsh sunlight so that it bounces back.
So where you'll find these are at the very tops of tree canopies, not at the bottom where they're shaded from things from below, from a shade from above. So those tillandsias are good examples of it. And again, no dirt, it doesn't need it. It uses its roots to anchor onto branches of trees.
And you had mentioned before that you really started out, well, I don't know, started out, but you really got into bromeliads, and obviously these are in the Bromeliaceae as well, so.
They are, and compared to orchids, I found that they're kind of nice to look at even if they're not flowering. So bromeliads for me were the combination of not only being something that was an epiphyte and relatively easy to grow in South Florida, but it was pretty even if it wasn't flowering. And then the last thing about bromeliads that makes it unique compared to orchids is orchids are found all over the world. But bromeliads are largely New World plants, which means they evolved after the continental shift between where, you know, the way South America fits into Africa, like if it was a jigsaw puzzle. Well, there's only one relatively primitive genus of bromeliads called Picarnia that grows on the west coast of Africa. Everything else is New World. So they're relatively recently evolved, and something about that just sort of fascinated me too, because they're far from extinction from natural processes, but considering that they come very much from Central South America, including the rainforests, we're sort of accelerating that potential extinction process. And not so much with bromeliads, but other plants that may hold the secrets of the chemicals that we talked about as my bias from chemistry. We don't know yet about what's out there that we may not be able to harness for the next generation of medicines.
I think that's a very prescient point, obviously. Going back on the tillandsia and some of the bromeliads, I also really love the theory of how they wound up in the trees. And that theory is that it just got so competitive on the ground that they eventually started to creep up in the trees. And I just think when we think of plants, we don't think of like mobility all the times, but they surely figure out how to move one way or another, even if it's over
sure
many,
do.
many, 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 many millennia.
That's Aki.
Oh, look at it. Huge.
And so Aki is perhaps more popular in the Caribbean, but it will grow here. Now those fruits, if used, say, by Jamaican people, even my wife's family would know how to use this for culinary purposes as a starch. With certain fish dishes, it does very well. The problem is, and not a problem, but knowing how to use it, is the seeds that are in it, not unlike apple seeds, actually have cyanide. Yes, they do. And when that cyanide is released, the actual fruit expands, it splits open, releasing the gas. So in fact, the only time to eat those would be after they're ripe and have sort of burst open themselves, remove the seeds, and then it's the fruit that's quite safe to eat, but not the seeds when the fruit's intact like that.
Well, the cat is cleaning himself. I think it's time for the greenhouses. So what's this greenhouse all about?
Well, this is a hybrid house in essence because it's open on the sides, and the sides that it's open is where our prevailing breezes come from. So the breezes pass through here, but it's covered with plastic on the roof and the other side walls in order to offer us protection from the outside elements and somewhat the sun. So it gets a nice diffuse light. I mentioned before that light is the key for feeding. It allows me to feed remarkably little, I will put in a slow time release food with some of the soils if it's a plant that needs that. Obviously, epiphytes like orchids don't need that. But other than that, I feed remarkably rarely, and yet this is what happens here with mitigating the extremes of heat or cold. And the way we try to mitigate for the heat is with the fans moving. You might hear a little hum in the background. There's really good air circulation here.
It does feel very nice. It's actually very comfortable in here.
And because I like to grow epiphytes, remember what's the other benefit of being up in the trees in addition to light? The ventilation, the airflow there is very different than at the ground level.
That's right.
And even though this house is only about 16 feet tall, when in the coldest of cold, the cold air sinks, the hot air rises. So very few plants in here are actually at the floor level. They're up on benches or even suspended from above. And so when we get very cold, the water that comes in here is not misting from above, but it's actually our groundwater, not reverse osmosis purified water from an above ground tank. That's room temperature. But underground, in a very cold night, the ground temperature water stays much warmer than the air. So by misting under the ground, capturing some of that heat that rises is how we keep the temperatures in here from getting too low. So water, in fact, is used both for heating and cooling. Saves on the gas, propane, or electricity. The only thing we're running is a few pumps and fans. So with the goal being to mitigate the extremes of heat and cold, this is the result of it in South Florida. And mind you, that's after our pretty significant cold snap the other day.
I like how you're growing a number of these in quite big tubs. Is there a reason for that? Is it just because like a lot of the begonias, for instance, like to spread?
Only because I don't sell any of this. They're bigger specimens that would make an impact if it was shown for display in a plant show, things like that because of the size. Fact is, these tubs, as big as they look, about 2/3 what's underneath that soil line on top is just perlite, something to freely drain. Because most of the plants you see in here would not have deep roots. They'd all be crawling on the surface. So these kinds of pots allow me to do that. There's great holes in the bottom and they are all freely draining. But the size is there so that they can be brought in to show a specimen in a show instead of a small potted.
Look at that massive Anthurium leaf back there. Is that a veitchii?
Yeah, this is Anthurium veitchii. There are a few different forms of this. Obviously, the thing is the pleating of the leaves in that long, long, long length. So, Anthurium veitchii.
Gorgeous leaf.
It is very nice. Now, some Anthuriums do not cross with others. There are genetic incompatibilities. So even though neither of these is a traditional bird's nest, but they're more or less, velvet leaf ones like you saw before, this would be different and not compatible to breeding with, but it is compatible with other things, and some of the crosses that are made elsewhere in the world of this are fascinating.
This is exquisite too, to the left of this, just the venation, the way that the venation travels down. And it's almost like a pure black without any subveins,
Well, this plant is one that I got many years ago from a local grower and friend. Tim Anderson was his name. He's been gone many years now, but probably 30 to 35 years ago, I got the first plant with similar veining and have selected over the years darker and darker forms of it. Now, when I saw this for the vein pattern, I looked at it and I said, gee, that looks cool. My kids came and they saw it and they looked right up here at the sinus up here. And you know what they said? They said, oh, Spider-Man.
Oh my gosh, you're so right.
Because they saw a Spider-Man logo.
Yeah.
We actually decided, because of the dark color in the back, to call it Black Widow.
Oh, perfect.
Sounded like a sexy name. But you're right, the vein pattern on this is very different than, say, some of the ones you see over there, which is more like a lightning bolt, electricity.
Right. No less striking, just very different.
Very different.
Yeah.
So even crosses between these, I can take this and cross it with the one on the end there, and anything in between happens. Or the way I like to say it, yes, the parents are notably different, But with parents that are that good looking, how ugly could the kids be?
Exactly, exactly. And I noticed you actually had some seedlings over here.
Yeah.
In your estimation, and I know you might not fully grow them out all here, you might start them here and then get them moved to another greenhouse, but how long does it usually take to germinate here?
Generally from 30 up to 90 days. But most things have germinated after 60 days here, most times of the year. So these were some crosses that I was doing to try to bring out the red colors that some of these have. So, I mean, this may be a good example there.
So you could tell pretty early on, these are still quite young. I mean, they're past the cotyledon stage, but you could tell that that one is going to potentially be a remarkable one, maybe even this one right here.
Some of them identify themselves at a very early stage like this, but overall, I select from things generation after generation to try to pull out certain things to breed with after it grows to a mature size and can support flowering, germinating, and the stresses that reproduction bring on plants when they're too small.
I'd imagine that not everybody has the patience for that. What would you tell folks who are interested in potentially getting into breeding plants that way, testing them over generation or generation? What joy does that bring you?
Well, it's a transition from a collector's mentality to being a custodian. To begin with, it's not a time-limited project. It's an evolution of maybe a vision or a plan or how challenging a given plant is to work with. Anthuriums generally take several years from growing a seedling to flowering it at a responsible size to then using those flowers and plants to breed again. So each successive generation, and I've probably done 7 or 8 over my life of working with these, requires first a collector's sort of mentality. I like that look, I like this look. Let's bring them together and see if I can grow another one. Because if you can't grow it to sustain it, whether you're a collector, breeder, or anything else, it really makes no difference. So part of it is learning how to keep the plants alive. But there's a transition that happens from most people from being a collector to doing it over time, where you realize that it's not as important to collect every plant that's in the world. It becomes unfeasible. Everybody has space limits, including me here. But what transition happens is sort of an understanding that we're here as custodians. And so a custodian has a different role. A custodian's role is not to have it for me, but to have it for everybody else in the future. And considering how many of the things that you even see here are not just rare and exotic, but they come from places in the world which are very quickly disappearing. The land where they may be native to. And we're not just talking about the chemicals for medicinal purposes. We're talking about, in this case, tropical ornamental plants. The beauty of them is something that now becomes more of a custodial responsibility to sustain. So anybody who's going to be a collector, I encourage you first, be a good grower. Because whatever you've collected and paid sometimes dearly for, you might as well be able to responsibly sustain. And after you've done that for enough things, start to think of yourself more as a custodian so that when you leave, and sometimes it may be in an untimely way, somebody else can pick up that torch and carry it further for the next generation. So it's not only the plant's generation, it's our own generations as humans and how we're responsible for the planet. Want to see a cool plant?
Yeah, let's go see it.
And it's got a few flowers, but I find this to be really...
Oh, the Aeschynanthus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not many people grow them here, and they are gorgeous.
Interesting. You know, it is a popular house plant, and I think they grow very well indoors.
Oh my God, they're so showy, and then the red comes out after you just see black all over the place.
Yeah.
But I think it's a beautiful plant, and even you had looked at the backs of these before when it was in the avocado tree.
Yeah, the verrucosums.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's all sorts of fascinating things. And here's another plant that I haven't been able to find more of, but I think is gorgeous. Fire fern.
Oh, I thought you were going to point this out. I've never seen this.
Well, that too, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment. So, this is fire fern. It's an oxalis type of a plant.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And it has a trifoliate leaf, those leaflets, and it has a trifoliate leaf.
These are a Homolemena,
Yeah, look at how
and
gorgeous.
unfortunately very cold sensitive.
One has a flower in it.
Yeah,
No,
they'll
that's a
come up-
no.
Yeah, no, it's a flower.
coming
It's a
out.
flower coming up. It's sort of a chartreuse
Yeah.
color. So, the plant you're looking at now is called Tacca integrifolia, and it's otherwise commonly called the white bat plant. The flowers are incredibly ornate. There's not in flowers in the one you're showing now.
But it
I'll
has
show you what
funky
the flowers look like.
whiskers and all this other kind of stuff. Yeah,
but you see those tubers? The tubers, as used by people where this is indigenous to, Bangladesh, are known to be helpful medical-wise as a digestant, something that helps to aid digestion. And it's actually packaged, put in pill form in Bangladesh as a botanical medicine. I'll show you a picture of what it looks like. Now this, in essence, is another botanical medicine. This is Psychotria elata, E-L-A-T-A. Otherwise, if you can take a close-up picture of the flower there,
Yep.
known as hot lips for an obvious connection. But the genus name, Psychotria, you could think of the word psychotic, but
Psychology
it is a
of the brain.
well, not so much that as much as a psychedelic. Because the fact is that the plant's chemicals in this do have psychedelic properties, but it's an important component of the way a shaman in Colombia, say, in the wild, would use this in combination with ayahuasca, another well-known chemical in there that acts as a psychedelic. When used together with this, some of the side effects of that ayahuasca tend to be mitigated. So very often, ancient cultures pass along the wisdom of which plants' chemicals are combined with which others. And there becomes the balances that one individual plant may not offer a human being, that combinations can, such that the lowest effective dose of a certain medicine becomes possible. Spiritus sancti. Philodendron, this is a red form, where you can tell by the red color underneath here. Relatively unusual, doesn't flower very readily. There are some tissue cultures of this. Even a variegated form that I understand recently has been introduced.
I didn't realize they were doing tissue culture form.
Well, it's what's probably destined for the future with a lot of plants.
Yeah.
Those that may not be easy to propagate or have natural pollinators, and the interest in this particular plant family of aroids for getting more out to people where they otherwise wouldn't be able to find them. So the original source plant of this came from a collector in Hawaii. It's put out actually 2 heads now, obviously pretty healthy. It didn't do very well outside in the yard. I tried it and it almost died back to nothing, so I sort of resuscitated it, brought it back here, and it's plentiful again. This seems to be a survivor, but again, it's certainly the right plant, but I think of the whole property, this may be the only right place for it, picking up on that master gardener mantra. And again, master gardener programs in all states of the country are great resources because most notably, they're generally county specific, not simply state specific. And if you're in a state such as Florida or California, where you have latitudes that tremendously change the agricultural conditions in one part of the state or the other, the teachings of master gardeners within that community becomes the voluntary sector that allows other farmers to know how to grow successfully in that particular area of the state.
I don't know if the master gardeners will tell you much about the Philodendron spiritus sancti, though.
Maybe unless you're coming from a different part of the world.
Yeah.
No, these are not indigenous to the U.S., even Hawaii, but they seem to do very well in some subtropical environments, including Hawaii, and now at least evidenced by this, South Florida.
And then talk a little bit about like the water you give, because you're a big believer in, providing the best water quality possible for the plants. Talk about the importance
You want to
of
do
that.
it from outside here where the holding tank and the machine is? And
Yeah, why not? Let's
give you that little bit.
Yeah, let's go do it.
And again, this is another Hoffmannia. Look at the leaf. That would never happen with the standard water that's used here.
Yeah.
Too many little pleats and places for those salts to get trapped and sort of to eat away at the leaf. You want to try the water? Want to try Miami's freshest?
I would love to try.
Miami's freshest right here. Just push down.
Oh. That is the best water. No kind of metallic taste afterwards. So this is obviously where the reverse osmosis water comes into play here. And it looks very technical. Take us through it.
Well, this site actually is where the original fruit grove that this property evolved from, mangoes and avocados, started. This is where the wells were, cisterns, things like that, over 100 years ago. And so we have very good water beneath our feet, but it's water that goes through what we're standing on, which is limestone, coral rock, from ancient coral beds. So it goes down and gets filtered, but our aquifer then, by going through that, has a lot of what limestone has, which is calcium. Actually, it's calcium carbonate, which is chalk. If you water with that over and over and over, and it waters a plant and dries and waters and dries over years, or even only months sometimes, you'll see a layering of that chalk on the leaf surfaces. And I always thought of that as compromising photosynthesis because it's putting an artificial cover on those leaf surfaces.
It literally looks like sunscreen on the leaves.
Exactly. So if the leaf's importance is to photosynthesize as a way to get its own nutrients, I figured that's one of the key reasons why plants that I saw in the South Pacific weren't having to deal with it. Their leaves were new and clean. So the best way we have that I found to mimic what's in the South Pacific is by purifying the water here. And that technology evolved about 28 years ago. Actually, in 1992, we fought the last modern war, or the first modern war in the desert. It was called Operation Desert Storm. Iraq invaded Kuwait and set up in Kuwait City's desalinization plant, which was RO, reverse osmosis, but of an institutional or municipal size. Years later, our military actually miniaturized that. Now you can get it for under your kitchen sink. But the intermediate stage, which all of the agriculture community went to for interior escape plants, were machines like this, which have membranes. This is a membrane. There's two more on this machine. And when I put my well water or my groundwater through this, it processes it in such a way that I store it in an above ground tank that's actually over there. Now that tank then, the water quality in there is as close to rainwater as we can get. And what does that mean? Well, it means there's no solutes or salts in it anymore. So it doesn't leave that film covering on the plants. But it also means by taking out the calcium carbonate, we're actually changing how acidic the water is. The water in Miami is normally not acidic. It goes through limestone, which makes it what's called alkaline or basic. As a matter of fact, the water tastes a little sweeter, so almost all municipalities will have their water a little on the alkaline side.
Which is when you say you want a sweeter water, it's making it more alkaline.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And not many people would know this, but even the name Miami, it actually means sweet water. So the sweet water that indigenous people down here thousands of years ago recognized was it's delicious. Okay? The problem, it's delicious for us as humans. Plants actually prefer water that is relatively more acidic.
Slightly more, because I do know that, I come from Pennsylvania and we had, with all the coal that we burned, we made it so acidic. And I think when we think about the alkaline acidity scale, it's logarithmic. It's not a linear thing. So it can get really acid really fast or very alkaline very fast.
And so when you say very acidic, the difference between a neutral, what's called pH, which is 7, alkaline or higher numbers, most municipal water here is going to come in at around 8.5. But if you push it in the acidic side, lower numbers, research done around the time of World War II, this is nothing new, found that plants prefer generally an environment closer with a pH of 6.
Yes, and in Pennsylvania, we border on 4.5 to 5.5, which could get dangerous because a lot of microorganisms in soil can't live any longer, and it also affects the way that they uptake micronutrients and macronutrients.
So what's found at that particular pH closer to 6, though, is what's called bioavailability of not only the principal nutrients, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, potassium, but even the micronutrients. So if you had to hang your hat on one pH from which to provide plants for their overall ability to get fed, it would probably be a pH of 6, which fortunately is right where that water comes in at. So I guess it's sort of tailor-made for most plants' preferences. Obviously, there are different plants that have evolved to tolerate slightly more acidic and slightly more alkaline. But for the plants that I like to grow in tropical rainforests, including on the other sides of the world, a pH of about 6 is where I landed. And that's what this machine produces.
When I was in Thailand, we went to see a conservatory that's based on limestone, because they also have a lot of limestone there. And I think that a lot of the plants there would probably do well in this environment as well.
And it's just mitigating those extremes of heat and cold. So that's really how this garden's evolved, from the greenhouses to that conservatory protected space to being surviving right out with no protection other than the natural canopy that over years develops sort of as protection for the things lower down.
Well, thank you so much for that RO Water 101. You have such a wonderful collection, and I love your message of going from a collector to custodian mentality, because we can't have all the plants, nor should we. And I think it's a very important message to people, especially as the years go on, what actually makes sense to us as well as we go on with our plant love. So thank you so much, Dr. Jeff Block. I really appreciate it.
Don't miss a beat on this channel, because we have more great tours and houseplant tips in store. Subscribe and hit that notifications bell so you know when the next episode arrives. And if you'd like to support in other ways, consider tipping or becoming one of our illustrious sustaining members. You can find out more on our website at homesteadbrooklyn.com, including the range of online courses we have, from the 125 houseplant care spreadsheet to houseplant basics and the Houseplant Masterclass. And don't forget that we have a new channel covering outdoor gardening, herbs, permaculture, agroforestry, and homesteading over at Flock Finger Lakes. We'll see you in the next episode.